As soon as we start talking about climate change in any context, we have to start worrying about future projections. So obviously you expect someone to take either RCPs, the representative concentration pathways, or the shared socioeconomic pathways, and take the outputs and force some form of agricultural models to look at the future of agriculture. But first let's look at this chapter 7, which provides a figure on a way of diversifying agricultural practices to hedge against warming and extremes, etc. Levels of diversification. On-farm diversification can be created at various structural levels, offering multiple benefits that include environmental and ecological management, supporting livelihoods through income stability and minimizing risks, supporting food security through encouraging diversity of diet, improving farming output by reducing pest and disease infection, and maximizing returns. So this book is very particularly focused on sustainable agriculture and climate change adaptation as a way to ensure food security. So it has slightly different focus. We have talked about ecological management issues and livelihood issues and nature-based solutions in this context, managing grazing, pasture land, agricultural land, tree-based farming, minimal tillage approaches, and all those good things. In terms of diversification system, you can think of off-farm diversification, diversifying product range, value addition, dietary balance, and income generation. We have also discussed how reducing meat consumption is expected to reduce people's carbon footprints, but one has to be very careful because you could be riding a bicycle and eating a lot of meat and have a much higher footprint than somebody who's driving an SUV and is a vegetarian. So it's a portfolio approach that is better in the sense, where are you emitting what, instead of just focusing on meat consumption, because there are cultural practices involved and behavioral change for humans is very different. And the other complication is that you have artificial meat, plant-based meat, and so on, which are made to taste like the meat you know and you like. So is that really going to get you off meat, or it's just going to help you continue the taste of meat and someday say, forget it, I'll eat the real meat? Or what are the chemical processes used to make plant-based meat and artificial meat? Do they have any unintended consequences? All these are critical questions when you think about adaptation in general, especially including dietary changes. On-farm diversification can include structural and functional. So crop diversification is always something that's good even without climate change in terms of maintaining soil health, crop rotation and diversification. Field diversification and land diversification are also critical. Functionally speaking, ecological management, which includes tree-based farming, for example. Resiliency and climate change shock absorption. So agroforestry can do that in terms of reducing evaporation, soil erosion, soil moisture loss, drought resilience increased, and so on. Nutrition diversity and health. This is again about behavioral change and choices people make, so hard to change that, but one can always hope that some kind of a trigger will happen. Just like smoking became a stigma, maybe polluting becomes a stigma and we'll start eating more carefully. Enhanced productivity and income stability. That's much more of a socioeconomic problem as well. Jumping to chapter 9, it looked at projected yields for key agricultural commodities for 2030 and 2050. So this is using various IAMs and various crops and various combinations of SSPs. So we are looking at maize, rice, soybean, wheat, and then for 2030 and 2050. So you can see the various scenarios. SSP so these are various scenarios we have discussed elsewhere. So no CC is hypothetical future without climate change, so it's kind of a counterfactual world. And if you want details on SSPs and RCPs, I have lots of podcasts on those in the climate science course, climate change course, that you can look up. And these are different models. IPSL is the French model, and HADGEM is the UK model. So you can see that models produce different results also, but also depends on which crop you are looking at. So they are different for maize and rice, but almost the same for wheat. What does this mean? So we have to worry about these details as well, because SSPs themselves have uncertainties. Climate change coming out of that has uncertainties, and then you have uncertainties in translating those to agriculture. I have a phone call. Give me a second. Okay, sorry about that. I'm having to move outside, stand in the corridor to do this because my apartment is being cleaned and the phone call was from the doctor's office, so I had to take it. Okay, so we are looking at projections of crop yields for the future using multiple scenarios. SSP2, if you remember, is middle of the road scenario that you can look up elsewhere. So there are uncertainties, as I said, which we have to always worry about, especially in terms of adapting to these projections and making choices that may be irreversible or could be what are called maladaptations. So looking at another chapter from World Capture Fisheries and Aquaculture Production numbers for historically going from 1950 to about 2014 here in millions of tons. So you can see that the capture production has plateaued because overexploitation has happened, number of ships out there have increased, and the subsidized fisheries is beginning to reach its peak. Demand has grown steadily as well, but people are also becoming more aware of their choices in terms of trying to choose sustainable fisheries and so on. But the other thing that has happened is that aquaculture, which has been around for decades, has begun to ramp up. There are issues associated with that, whether they are sustainable, whether they create problems like sea lice around where they are done, and so on. But nonetheless, people do consume, and this is a big export business for countries like China and India as well, especially things like shrimps. So you can see that is beginning to grow, and this has plateaued. There are many ideas on continuing sustained ocean exploitation, but obviously the fisheries business tends to be a bit of a wild west in terms of people out there in the middle of the ocean exploiting. So to conclude this book, we will look at something it recommends in terms of sustainable agriculture for food security and adaptation, which is the community participation. So I will go through their schematic before we move on to a couple of other papers on genetic adaptations or engineering our way out of climate impacts on agriculture for food security. So this is again a schematic. So here are the processes and the outcomes, and there is a lot of information here, so we can take our time. So we have conditions, so community entry. So this is for community participation, conditions for setting up objectives and planning implementation, and then focusing on outcomes. Okay, so this needs to worry about representation of all, opinions from all. Pilot surveys may be needed for that, and building relationships, because a rapport or credibility, legitimacy and salience of the people doing community consultation is very important for making sure participation does happen. So setting up objectives, they have to be clear, realistic and agreed for co-production, and collective interest and long-term benefits have to be clear for setting up the objectives as well. Moving to planning implementation, you need to have availability of funding, education and skill upliftment if you are asking people to adjust their livelihoods or even change livelihoods and so on related to food production. Coordination of agencies involved in this, as well as roles and responsibilities responsibility sharing has to be well defined so people trust the whole process. And then outcomes would include many users, higher number of participants would be a good thing, good maintenance, so you have a sustainable plan for community participation and sustained feedbacks. Willingness for future collaboration depends on this credibility, legitimacy, and salience, and the outcome in terms of whether they think you are providing useful information that helps them or they think you are just wasting their time. Farmers have a lot of empirical evidence and experiential knowledge on how to deal with uncertainties anyways, so they need to be convinced that you are offering some value addition to their experience. And the satisfaction of chief. Okay, so could be in a tribal context or could be organized farmers, cooperatives, and so on. Steps of community entry for effective local community participation. Again, you want to set out good project objectives, which of course is sustainable income, livelihoods, their livestock have to be protected, their food security has to be guaranteed based on whether it's the society that's involved or the producers of food and meat and dairy products are involved. Okay, so we can start anywhere. Let's say we start at the top here. Identify village link man to reach all groups. This is critical. Meet marginalized groups so that people don't feel like again they are being left out of the game. And then you feed it into pilot survey about village socioeconomic issues, which is in a loop where you can start from the previous step, collect basic information on the village, and with this input, pilot survey about the village socioeconomic issues. Survey findings have to be synthesized. Developing tentative objectives has to happen in terms of the steps for effective local community participation. And this is going to a step of village meeting with chief and all group representatives. So invite all groups and freely express opinions, so nobody should feel like they are oppressed or that they are not allowed to speak freely. And on the other side, it is getting input from identifying the village link man, which is up here. Contact assemblyman, meet village chief to brief the project, ask the dates for village meeting, and then have village meetings to set out good project objectives. Obviously this is a typography, and exact implementation and steps will depend on which society you're dealing with and whether it has really a village chief or has a elected government with a head, and then within his government, the panchayats in India, for example, there is a person responsible for doing this who will handle this instead of the village chief, and how they, whenever there is an elected body, there are electoral vote banks which may be based on socioeconomic classifications, castes, all kinds of issues. So all of that has to be dealt with, especially in terms of making sure marginalized groups are represented in the process and involved in the co-production. Okay, so we'll come back and look at the genetic aspects or engineering aspects of how we want to or how we have already been adapting to climate change to minimize impacts on agricultural systems and crop productions. Also livelihoods is included in that. Okay, so I'll stop this here.